Perry Saturn is a name that some newer fans may not recognize, but in the mid-90s and early 2000s, he was a regular on ECW, WCW, and WWF TV. But while fans got to enjoy some interesting Perry Saturn storylines, most weren't aware of the tragic past Perry had come from, or the tragedies he would soon face. Perry Arthur Sadelow was born October 25, 1966 in Cleveland, Ohio. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before life would serve him his first major blow. Perry's stepfather would enter the picture early in Perry's life, and according to Perry, was extremely abusive. One of these beatings would be so severe as to actually cause Perry's lazy eye that he would live with for the rest of his life. It was around this time that Perry would discover professional wrestling. In his own words, he was drawn to the sport because he felt nobody would pick on guys like that. Perry would remain a fan of wrestling, but saw it as an unattainable dream and never considered it a career option until much later in his life. At the time, Perry began training in judo and kenpo karate, and after a few years would begin to see some success in these sports. According to Perry, he would even attain a black belt in kenpo karate by the age of 14. However, this would work against Saturn in some ways. Due to his traumatic home life, Saturn would begin lashing out and would start using his martial arts training in the streets. Turning to a life of crime, Perry would soon find himself in legal trouble. According to Saturn, he was a convicted felon by his mid-teens for violent crimes. Saturn was ordered to live in a detention home until the age of 21. However, Perry would discover a way out of this predicament. Joining the army would absolve him of his convictions and he could leave the detention center so long as he went through with his training. According to Saturn, he scored high enough on his physical and written exams to be accepted by the U.S. Army Rangers, an elite division of the U.S. Army who specialize in conducting raids within enemy territory. Fortunately for Saturn, he was enlisted during a time of peace and would complete his 4-year term without having to engage in active battle. According to Saturn, this training was one of the best things that could have happened to him. His training in the military taught him a level of discipline that he says helped him get his life back on track and away from crime. After leaving the army, he would eventually move to Boston to begin training in Killer Kowalski's wrestling school alongside future WWE head of creative, Triple H. Perry quite literally started from the bottom. During this time, he was unable to find a job that would allow him enough free time to continue training at Kowalski's. So with Perry unable to afford rent, he slept in his car for the first full year at Kowalski's, using a sleeping bag from his time in the army to protect himself from the cold Boston winter. When not training to wrestle, he would spend most of his time at the local gym as a form of shelter. For the first, but not the last time in his life, he was homeless. His wrestling career would begin to gain traction when he linked up with John Kronos. Forming the tag team The Eliminators, the pair would work the indie circuit for a few years before eventually being brought into Paul Heyman's ECW. They were there to job to the Steiner brothers, however they were able to impress Paul Heyman and he would sign them to a full-time contract. Saturn would begin making a name for himself in ECW, however this gift of success wouldn't come without its curse. Perry would develop a reckless in-ring style during his time in ECW, as did a lot of the guys in that locker room. On May 31st, 1996, Perry would attempt a moonsault to the outside floor, but the spot was mistimed and he took a nasty blow to the head upon landing. In this incident, it was reported that Perry Saturn actually fractured his skull. In footage that I'll blur here, Saturn was rushed to the backstage area where they would apply a pressure bandage to assist with the bleeding. However, Saturn would later return to the ring again for a planned interference in the main event, in which Saturn can be seen bleeding heavily through the pressure bandage and acting visibly confused and disoriented. Unsurprisingly, in the world of professional wrestling, Saturn would wrestle the very next night. Wrestling is wild. This injury, though not directly correlated, could have played a significant role in his future brain injury diagnosis. Having sustained a fractured skull, the likelihood of this is extremely high. Not to mention, further concussions would only add to the severity of his head trauma. With an injury like this, it was only a matter of time until pain medication would become an everyday necessity. After having some memorable moments in ECW, he would eventually sign with WCW, which is where his drug addiction would start to be a problem. Saturn claims that during his time in ECW, he was relatively clean, but in WCW, he was high all the time. Saturn recalls failing 3 drug tests in WCW, and when management asked him what they should do about it, Perry simply stated that they should just stop testing him. And they did. Stories of Saturn around this time are pretty wild. One infamous story told in recent years is an incident in a hotel hallway where Saturn and Raven would set up a slip and slide and wet it down with a sink hose. Saturn would lay on the slide with a certain phallic object strapped onto his head, and Raven would push Saturn down the slide toward a hired stripper who was, to put it delicately, waiting for him at the other end. They would also attempt using a fire extinguisher to propel Saturn down the slide, though all this really did was suffocate Raven. This may be an amusing story, however, it's certainly indicative of a man who was living life on the edge. With drugs running rampant through WCW, Saturn was unknowingly beginning his downward spiral. Saturn would move to the WWF in the year 2000. However, according to Saturn himself, it was during this time that his substance abuse really took control. His drug of choice was a strong opioid known as Nubane, an injectable pain reliever in which Saturn would inject under his tongue to ensure no needle marks would be evident on his body. This effectively hid his addiction from those around him, but according to Saturn, his addiction was bad. This might explain some of his actions during his WWF run. While he was always considered a good hand in the ring, Saturn was also infamously involved in 2 incidents where the action in the ring got a little too real. Most infamously in his match with Mike Bell, a quote-unquote jobber who was pitted against Saturn on the May 12, 2001 edition of Jacked. When Bell mistimed a hip toss and an arm drag, Saturn would begin pummeling Bell for real. Saturn would then throw Mike to the outside of the ring, in which Bell would take a nasty bump on the back of his head. As a former wrestler, I can say that throwing Bell to the outside was likely in an effort to get some separation so Saturn could cool down. Saturn threw some very stiff shots prior to this, which I think were completely unwarranted, but this bump on the floor was likely an accident. It doesn't seem that Saturn did anything in particular to cause Bell to land on his head. It looks to me that Bell's feet caught the rope on his way out and caused him to land poorly. However, an argument could be made that Bell was dazed from the punches Saturn threw before tossing him out of the ring. This could have caused Mike Bell to simply make a mistake. In any event, Saturn was definitely in the wrong here, and was punished later on with the infamous Moppy gimmick. Then again on December 22nd, Saturn would have a similar incident with another enhancement talent by the name of Brian Gamble. The story goes that Brian had family in attendance at the match, which was taking place in his hometown, and he apparently didn't want to look weak in front of that audience. Brian would essentially go into business for himself by shooting on Saturn to look strong in the match. Brian would then refuse to take a bump for Saturn when Perry delivered some strong attacks. The job of the enhancement talent is to do exactly that, enhance their opponent, or in other words, make the other guy look good. Saturn felt like Brian was refusing to sell for him and decided to do his job for him. Perry would hit Brian with a vicious spear out of the corner, which causes Brian's head to bounce off the canvas. The remainder of the match was clunky and awkward, with Brian continuing to not sell, leading Saturn to throw some stiff but relatively safe shots, before eventually putting Gamble into a pretty legit-looking armbar to finish the match. This instance was less severe than the Mike Bell incident. However, Saturn was beginning to show his temper and erratic behavior, perhaps amplified by his spiraling drug addiction. He states that at least the last year of his employment with the company, he has almost no memory of whatsoever. In 2002, Saturn would suffer an ACL injury, which would lead to Saturn spending most of his time at home rehabilitating. This injury would lead to more and more extreme substance abuse. Saturn was later released by the WWE in November of 2002. Following his release, Saturn would work for TNA and New Japan Pro Wrestling for a brief period of time. However, his drug addiction was simply too severe at this point to hold a stable career. With Saturn's now rampant drug abuse, he claims to have been spending thousands of dollars a week on substances, and in 2004, Perry Saturn would seemingly disappear. Very little is known about Perry during this time, so much so that during these years, many fans simply thought that Perry Saturn had died. However, in recent years, Saturn has stepped back into the public eye and has spoken about this time in his life. According to Saturn, in April of 2004, he was walking his then-girlfriend to work outside of Atlanta when he encountered two men sexually assaulting a woman. Having had combat experience in the army and martial arts training, Saturn quickly stepped in. According to Perry, he fought off the two men long enough for the girl to escape. However, one of the men was carrying a gun. Saturn would reportedly be shot twice, once in the neck and again in the collarbone. Unaware that he had been shot and simply thinking it was a punch, he continued to fight the two men off until the police arrived. Lucky to be alive, he was rushed to the hospital where they inserted 3 stainless steel screws in his neck, which he has to this day. In an appearance for U-Shoot, Perry Saturn showed off his scars. Though it was difficult to see on camera, he claims to be missing a significant part of his collarbone and says that the plastic surgery the doctors did on his neck left him with nothing more than a small scar.
I'm missing my collarbone. There's a big hole there from where my collarbone used to be. And here I have a plates and screws in my neck. They did a pretty good job of plastic surgery. It's only a little scar.
Really?
Following this incident in 2004, his substance abuse would continue to worsen as he dealt with the pain. He would seek stronger and stronger medications until a girlfriend of his at the time eventually introduced him to crystal meth. Due to his addiction, Saturn would lose everything, from making hundreds of thousands of dollars in WCW and WWF to once again being homeless and living on the street. Saturn would completely disappear for half a decade, with fans and even family members and friends unsure of his whereabouts. Fortunately, Perry Saturn would reappear in 2009, after thankfully getting himself sober and cleaning up his lifestyle. Saturn credited his new wife, Lisa Colmier, as well as his dog, for helping him battle back from his addictions. When speaking about his dog, Saturn was worried about what would happen to her if Perry were to die. So he made a promise to himself to at least outlive his dog so he could always be there to care for her. This gave Saturn a reason to live, and he used this to pull himself towards sobriety. As for his wife, the two were apparently living on the streets together, with Lisa being a now former addict herself. The two would help each other battle back from their addictions. However, while the catalyst for his disappearance seems to be the 2004 incident in which he got shot, there are some who dispute these claims. Though he appears relatively coherent in recent interviews, it is well documented that Saturn suffers from CTE and a diagnosis of moderate brain trauma. He himself has stated that he often suffers from memory loss and confusion. Couple this with his years of substance abuse, some claim that these issues have led to symptoms of delusion, intentional or not. Podcaster Tony DeBlasi, also known as Don Tony, would do a deep dive into this situation for an episode of The Don Tony and Kevin Castle Show. Don Tony, a former bounty hunter, checked police reports and hospital records to find no record of the incident. There was no police report in Atlanta that matched Saturn's recollection of the incident, nor were there any hospital admissions under his real or stage name. To take it a step further, Don Tony reported that there were no hospital injury reports in this time frame that matched Saturn's descriptions. Don Tony even reportedly looked into Saturn's tax records to find no claims of medical treatment or rehabilitation. But of course, even this can't be taken as proof that Saturn's story didn't happen. It simply calls the validity of it into question. Don Tony himself is not without his own controversies, and some say he's not the most credible source. In any case, there's always an opportunity for information to be missed or personal agendas clouding the investigation. But without any official reports of the incident, it's unclear what really happened in 2004. There's very little documentation about Saturn's personal life, especially during his disappearance. We do know that he's been married on 3 prior occasions. We know he has at least 2 children from these prior marriages with whom Perry has seemingly very little contact with. In fact, Perry's son seems to hold quite a lot of resentment toward his father, and there's little known about Perry's daughter other than this photo of the 2 of them together during Saturn's time in ECW. There is also documentation of Perry being in significant debt during the time of his disappearance. Perry had a tax lien with his second wife for $11,000 and owed an estimated $30,000 in back paid child support to his various ex-wives. Some believe that during his disappearance, while yes, he was battling addiction, he was also doing his best to stay off the grid. This meant he would not appear at wrestling events or other public functions to avoid being served for his outstanding debts. When Perry Saturn's former Eliminators partner John Cronus died in July 2007, Perry did not attend the funeral. It's speculated that he missed his former partner's funeral intentionally to avoid being served papers. Reportedly, there was a lawyer present waiting for Saturn's arrival. It's difficult to know for sure what the real truth is here. According to Saturn, one of his ex-wives passed away from a drug overdose, which I can't find much information on, nor can I even find the names or dates of when he married his ex-wives. I'm no investigative journalist, but I can say through all my research, his personal life remains shrouded in mystery. All we really know is what Saturn himself has told us. And knowing his history of trauma, brain damage, and drug abuse, it's not necessarily unreasonable to question the validity of his claims. One thing is for certain, Perry Saturn has had a very difficult life, and as fans of pro wrestling, we can thank him for his sacrifices and contributions to the business. And if nothing more, It's great to see that he was able to overcome his demons and avoid yet another tragic early loss of life in the crazy world of professional wrestling.